The Book Programme. Presented by Hannah Murray on Talk Radio Europe. Your voice in Spain.
Welcome back to today's book show. Going over to the Costa Blanca now to introduce John McGregor. He's written about his experiences that he spent in the Royal Air Force from 1967 to 72. In that time, he travelled to places like Bermuda, Singapore, the Maldives and Libya. The book's called Fairy Tales of an SAC. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me on to your programme.
Not at all. Thanks ever so much for joining us. So why did you decide to write this all down and share your story?
Well, I think I've been out of the Air Force since 1972, Hannah, but I think in all those 30 to 40 years, I've been carrying all the stories of the things that happened to me during those 5 years around with me in my head, and there wasn't time in that period to sit down and do it all, write it all down, but it was such a special, fun time for me that I always meant to when I had time, and it wasn't until I think it was 2003 I started to have a little more time on my hands, and I started doing things like the Open University and trying to keep my brain going, and in 2009 I'd already done some writing of short stories and magazine articles and things like that, but in 2009 I sat down and wrote the 38 chapters which make up Fairy Tales of an SAC, and I was lucky enough to send it off to a publisher who specialised in A, military, B, RAF and C, humour, and hopefully mine ticks the boxes, and it went from there, Hannah.
And interestingly enough, even writing it all down all these years later, you recalled them like it happened yesterday.
Well, that's funny you should say that, because it is like I do remember them so clearly, and I've got friends of mine now, I'm still in touch with one or two who we've kept in touch over the years, and they say I have that sort of memory. The joke I make is the Ozzy Osbourne story, that he can remember what happened 30 years ago like it was yesterday. I won't say the F word in it, but he can't remember what did happen yesterday, and I can relate to that. So yes, it's all very clear to me, those times, and as I say, I carried them around with me, those stories, so writing them down I didn't have too much of a problem remembering them.
So at aged 18, when you went into the force in 1967, how did you feel? Were you excited or scared?
Yes, I was. My father was a New Zealander and who came over in the war, and he was a pilot in the Fleet Air Arm, and I always wanted to fly, Hannah. That was my ambition, to be a pilot, but sadly it wasn't to be, but I was still mad keen on aircraft, so I joined the RAF and I became an electronic mechanic, air communications, which basically means an aircraft radio mechanic, and that's where the term fairy comes from, by the way. It's called Fairy Tales and SAC because we were called fairies, the people who dealt on the aircraft with the lighter side of the workload, working on electronic type stuff like electricians and navigation instruments. We were referred to as fairies.
And is that in a detrimental sense? Did they take the mickey out of you?
It works both ways, Hannah, because we call them heavies and oilies, and they used to come in, to our crew room where we were, let's face it, our duties were much lighter than theirs, and they would come in stamping and swearing and cursing because it was cold outside, and they'd say, we'd be playing cards and drinking coffee, and they'd say, you lot, you don't know what the work is, and we'd say, we don't get paid for what we do, we get paid for what we know, and that so there was plenty of ribaldry around in those days, and but one of the things I write about is the fact that it was an alternative Air Force I worked in, Hannah. It wasn't a sort of one full of bull and saluting and smart uniforms. In fact, it was completely the opposite. Would it be possible just to read you a little paragraph from the first chapter, which sort of sums it up, really?
Yeah, please do.
Right, the first chapter is I wake up somewhere where I shouldn't have been, and in a very short space of time, I've got to be away. In fact, I'm supposed to be catching an aircraft that's going to Cyprus, and I'm a little late, and I'm in trouble. And basically, the bit I'd just like to read you says, it's a closely guarded secret, but there are two Air Forces. The first, and best known to most people, is the shiny Air Force. This is where the grass is painted green, the coal black, and aspects such as discipline, marching, bull, and saluting are accepted as the norm. It took me about 9 months to discover the other Air Force when I was first sent up the line to join this mysterious and fascinating place. In this alternative Air Force, the aircraft is king. Everything else takes place to keeping the planes serviceable, thus enabling the other lot, that's the aircrew, to fulfill their minor role in actually flying the things. Such mundane matters as discipline only concern the shiny Air Force, not ours. Here in our crew room, I would sit and play cards and drink coffee with young men who, from the look of them, were the last people on earth you would expect to be serving members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. With their droopy Frank Zappa moustaches, long hair over their ears and collars, seemingly indifferent attitudes to life and bad language to make your hair curl, their apparent lack of discipline stood out a mile. But after a while you realised this wasn't the case. Commands were given and accepted casually, yet with mutual respect, and always with the same result. The job got done with little fuss. Occasionally requests, not orders, were met with seemingly aggressive protests and language to match. Invariably these were greeted with a laugh, a shrug and an equally colourful reply, but again always the task was carried out. Good friendships were born under such circumstances, sometimes under extremely arduous conditions of heat and cold, but good teamwork meant that when the job was done properly we could go out and party, which we did on almost every available occasion. The camaraderie I indicated is something I will never forget. During the 4.5 years I worked happily under this regime, I travelled the world for free, had many wonderful times and made many friends. That just about sort of sums up the 5 years, really. You were away from all the, what I call the shiny side of it, and there's nothing wrong with that side of the Air Force, but that's not where I was, and I was lucky enough, Hannah, to be based on a camp for the whole time, where every couple of months they said that the opportunity to travel came up, and I was able to see those places you mentioned, and you go from one end, the ones you said were the ones from one end of the spectrum to the other, from the lowest of the low, Libya, to the Maldives, Bermuda, New York I got to, so I was very, very lucky.
Tell us about Libya. Why was it the lowest of the low?
Oh, where to start with Libya? There's a place called El Adam, which is 18 miles inland from Tobruk, and to me, when I got there in 1967, it was just as though the Second World War had just finished. Everywhere was sort of rubble and half-built buildings, but the RAF camp, Hannah, was awful. It was just, the accommodation was stables, the food was, they weren't really stables, it just seemed like it, and the food was awful. It had absolutely nothing going for it. There were some horrible creatures crawling around, and it just wasn't a nice place to be, and I felt so very, very sorry. I've devoted a whole chapter to it in my book because it was so awful, and I was lucky enough to only be there for 3 weeks at a time, and horror-struck by what I saw. The only decent sort of thing to do was to go to the Mediterranean, and that was 18 miles away, and have a decent swim. But apart from that, it had nothing going for it. One day we were going to Tobruk on the bus, and we passed this rather large grey concrete fort sort of standing up in the middle of nowhere in this rubble that they called the desert, and I said to somebody, "What's that?" And they said, "Oh, that's the Commonwealth War Cemetery." I said, "Is it?" I thought, "Oh, what an awful place to die. There's no good place to die for your country, is there?" But this seemed to me the most awful. And they said, "Have a look at this." And then on the other side we passed this fabulous building, this mirage stood up out of the ground. I said, "What's that?" And I said, "Have a guess." I said, "The German War Cemetery?" I said, "Yes." So, I just thought then, what an awful place. But then, of course, the following year, I've been going there for about a year, for 3 weeks at a time, and Colonel Gaddafi staged a coup, and to the delight of a couple of 3,000 servicemen, promptly threw the British out. And they closed El Adam down, and we started going to some lovely places then, Hannah, like Malta and Cyprus, and also we did these long runs, they called them Navexes, where they took us to places like, they took on a couple of servicing crew when they went on these long hauls. We started off going to Singapore. That's when we stopped off in the Maldives, which was heaven, exactly the opposite end of the spectrum to El Adam, and that was a really lovely place, a little Air Force base called Gan, right in the middle of the Maldives. And then after that they changed that and went to Bermuda. So it's really, we felt we'd really arrived staying in a 5-star place in Bermuda. So, I can't fault the Air Force. I had a wonderful 5 years from that point of view.
I want to ask you about that. You described the fact that it changed you forever.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think I was a very naive young man. I came from the Midlands. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I've led a fairly sheltered life. I think what the Air Force does for you, or the forces generally, it knocks all your rough corners off, and you learn how to live with your fellow man. You are in a room with, I don't know, it ended up about 6, I think, others in the room, but it starts off with about 20 in a room. Nowhere to hide, Hannah. No place for the squeamish. Everybody's there for the same purpose, but you learn to take what's coming. There's an Air Force expression called ABC, which stands for all been changed. And the way we worked, there was often things happened which you thought something was going to happen, and then all of a sudden somebody would come out in and shout ABC, and we go, oh no, what's happening now? And things would be changed. So you learn that sort of instant readiness to change and that sort of thing. I came out a completely different person. I didn't want to stay in. I, in fact, I couldn't buy myself out as it happened. Not that I tried, but so I had to do my 5 years. But during the 5 years, I thought, no, I don't really like electronics. Thank you very much. I find it extremely boring.
I have to ask you just one more thing, because we're running out of time.
Yes, sure.
We're very sorry. About the ladies, because you do talk about the ladies.
Well, your lady in the last one said about the twins.
Yes.
There's a chapter about the twins.
Wonderful.
Yes, and they did sex, I have to say, Hannah. Not personally with me, he said quickly, but I knew several people who did. And
yes, your friends. It's one of those stories, is it?
Yes, my close friends.
Yes.
So, yes, I had a lovely time with the ladies. It was the 60s, Hannah. There was a lot happening outside the RAF gates in those sort of times. So, we had a wonderful time that way, and there was nurses and trainee teachers and telephonists and all sorts of young ladies down there to have a lovely time with, and I did.
I like the way you refer to the young ladies as the good, the bad, and the cosmetically challenged.
Well, we used to have competitions like that, to see who could pick up the most cosmetically challenged. When it livened up many a boring evening, but those are the sort of things you do at the time, don't you?
Of course.
It was the years of flower power and long hair and all that sort of thing, and that was happening outside the gates. Inside the gates, it was a bit different, but no, it was a lovely time to be around the late 60s. Somebody said to me, describe the 60s, and I said it was the decade when the world changed from black and white to colour.
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it.
Yes, and so your first chap who came on said about laughter being the best medicine, didn't he?
Yes.
And I said, I think, well, that's what my book's all about.
Fantastic. Well, if people, I'm sorry we're going to have to stop you there because I have to move on, but if people want to get a copy of the book, it's called Fairy Tales of an SAC. It's by John McGregor, and they can also find out more on the website, which is johnmcgregor.110mb.com, and there's a link to that on our site as well.
That's it. Can I just say it's by Woodfield Publishing in the UK?
Absolutely.
At $9.99, and they could ring me up if they can't get a copy on 6000088341, Hannah.
Perfect. John McGregor, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.